Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Teach Middle East podcast. My name is Lisa Grace Wilson, and today I have with me Professor Deborah Eyre, and we're talking world-class schools. We're talking high-performance learning, and we're talking about how schools all over globally, but especially here in the Middle East where we serve, how they can all become high-performing schools, regardless of the students, the staff. That is not a barrier. So, hi, Deborah. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, it's really nice to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
It's brilliant to have you. Can you introduce yourself to our audience for those who do not know who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm Deborah Eyre, and I'm the founder and chair at High Performance Learning. And I've had an entire career in education, in school, in government, in charitable trusts, and I was also global education director for Nord Anglia Education before setting up High Performance Learning. And the thing about me is I'm passionate about teaching and learning. I'm really interested in how students get to be successful learners. And that's what my research has been throughout my career.
Brilliant. I didn't realize you were at Nord Anglia. I worked with Nord Anglia for a few years as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I was in the PPP program here, and Nord Anglia was the company that I worked with for 2 years in that program. But I know they've got a wide reach in terms of schools and education globally. So yeah, I didn't know that we shared that.
Well, that I didn't know that either. So that is just goes to show how big they are as a company.
Yeah, for real. Okay, high performance learning. Before we get into high performance learning, I wanted to find out a little bit more in terms of the research that you conducted some years ago. What led to that research, and what were your findings from that?
Okay, well, I suppose I've been really interested in this whole kind of question of how people get to be successful learners, and I've been interested in it for over 35 years. And to begin with, I think the sort of people believed that there were only certain people who could become very high performers. So that, some people were naturally either gifted or more able or whatever you want to call them. And that they were kind of subset of the population, and they were the people who could achieve these dizzy heights, and the rest of us would never get there. And we thought that primarily because we thought that actually our our brains were constructed in such a way that it just simply didn't make it possible. And in the middle of the 20th century and towards the end of the 20th century, that was the belief amongst many psychologists. So for me, I started off my work by looking at those people who were deemed to be capable of high performance and trying to understand what it was that they actually did that made them so successful. And also what might we do in school to support that. And I guess that was a big piece of my research over really quite a long period of time. But I had a period of time in the noughties, from 2002 to 2007, when I was running a big program for the UK government. And I had a research team as part of that program. And we were researching into this whole area. And it confirmed for me something which was a hypothesis that had been kind of growing over the whole time for me, and it was sort of two things, and they were both really significant. And in 2010, I wrote a think tank paper about these two things. And the first was to say that all of the research is now pointing in the direction that there isn't a subset of people that probably most of us could get to high levels of performance if we got the right circumstances and we were minded to do it. So, and actually having these kind of categories of people, named different types of people, is really dangerous, because if you're not selected into that group, then you will never perform highly because you don't get the opportunities. So, if you thought about that in the conventional school environment, if you're not in the top set, then you don't get the kind of top set opportunities. So if you're in the second set, it doesn't matter how hard you try or how well you do, you'll never be as good as the top set because you're just not getting the same diet. So this kind of selection piece it's more it's more divisive than you might think, because it cuts off opportunities. So that was my first kind of piece of conclusion, was that that actually, if we have a cutoff point in that kind of way, we are doing serious damage to people who don't make the cut. And it doesn't matter when we do that cut, whether we choose, when we do that selection at, 18, 12, 5, it doesn't matter. As soon as you make that kind of selection, then you're cutting off opportunities for others. And equally, and on that kind of piece, I was particularly exercised about the fact that when you look across the research across the world, and that's what I was commissioned to do a major meta-analysis, that it is the case that the most disadvantaged students are least likely to make the cut. And it doesn't matter which country of the world you look at. The minority group in that country is less likely to be selected as being amongst the most stable, or whatever you want to call them. So that's a real worry, because it means that this whole approach might be kind of compounding inequity in the system. So that was my first thing, was to say, we've got to move away from the traditional bell curve of having people put into different categories as being capable of different things. We're probably all capable of getting there. Okay. Then the second thing that I kind of put in my think tank paper, which was published in one of the UK big think tanks, was to say, and not only that, we're probably all capable of getting there, and we know and understand how people get there. And there's a lot of consensus from research across the world about that journey. So people might use slightly different words to describe things, but they all agree broadly what it is that makes the difference. So I guess my kind of, so but I get to 2010, I make this big, bold statement, and I get two responses, right? Then one is people who said, you're absolutely crazy. What we need to do is to identify students as early as possible and put them in the right box and give them the right diet. And you're headed in completely the other direction. And then the second thing was, other people said to me, actually, I think you've presented an overwhelming and compelling set of evidence. But what would it look like if you did that in a school? How would it work? How could we move schools from doing what they have been doing to working in that kind of way? So I guess that second challenge kind of got me into the space where I created high performance learning, which is the mechanism, the codification of the research, and then a mechanism for making that happen in school. So when we say, what is high performance learning, what research base is it based on? It is some of my research, but basically it's the codification of the known knowledge in this area. And that means that we're always updating it and refreshing it. But broadly, we know some very convincing things, which, if you focus on them in school, makes one heck of a lot of difference to how your students achieve. And it's really that simple.
Yeah.
You believe, and then you do the things that matter, and then you get an outcome which completely transcends anything we've ever had in education before.
So we're gonna unpack some of those things that matter. But before we get into that, I want to go back and talk a little bit about brain elasticity. What did the research find about brain elasticity, and what kind of findings nullified the conventional thinking that we have this fixed brain and that's all you get, and whether you're set from birth to be either good or bad. What has the research debunked so recently?
Yes, I mean, really, the absolute core of it is that the brain is exquisitely plastic, and that because of that, we can build and shape the brain. And in fact, that's happening to our brains all of the time, whether we're doing it deliberately or not. Just the experiences that we are having of building new neural pathways. And interestingly, from the point of view of education, we know that you can create new neural pathways really quickly. So, for example, the research that's been done at the Harvard Institute for the Developing Child, that looks a lot at work on young children and has a really accessible website, if anybody's interested, with lots of ideas. kind of part of what they're kind of saying is it probably takes about 20 minutes to create a new neural pathway in a child's brain. So that's, that's during a lesson. It's a short space of time. And so we can shape how people's brains are developing. That's what we know. And so it's happening anyway. We can do it more deliberately and more purposefully to a good outcome. We know two other things, or three other things that I'm going to mention that are important. The first of those is that we also know that there are certain things that make the brain freeze, and it make it very difficult for children to learn, and that's normally known as toxic stress. And basically, if a child is in that state, either because of something that's happening in school or because of something that's happening at home, it's really difficult for the brain to respond to that. It moves into a different mode in terms of how it operates. So, I think we've always known in education that the old Maslow's triangle, that you have to feel comfortable and happy before you can learn. Turns out from neuroscience that there is actually something that is actually occurring in your brain when you're stressed and unhappy. So Maslow was right. He just didn't know how that works, and neuroscience is demonstrating it. The other thing is that we can develop these new neural pathways any time in our life. So even me, and I'm getting old, so I can still develop new neural pathways. I can still learn to excel in areas that I've never touched before. And I think you kind of know that really, because people who, when they retire, take up art or learn the violin or all those kinds of things. It's just a bit harder when you're older, but it's still possible. But so we're developing it over time. So one of the things that says is if an individual child does not excel at the beginning of school, or indeed by the end of school, it's not a lost hope, because actually we continue to develop. So this kind of idea, if you haven't done it by this time, you're just not up to it. That's all wrong. And then the third thing I kind of say is that the two most productive times for this brain plasticity are both within the time when we're formally schooling. So the first time is in the sort of primary age range. And I think we always knew that. People have known for a long time that the early years is a crucial golden period for schooling. But it's beyond that in the primary years. But I think what we didn't know, and there's been some great research on this, particularly through Oxford University about teenagers, is that the teenage years are the golden years for learning. And it is because in neuroscience, what happens with the brain is that whatever the neural pathways you were born with, you develop new ones over the whole time that you're developing up to around the beginnings of adolescence. And at the beginnings of adolescence, the brain, it's really clever stuff, really. It's how they describe it. It does some pruning. So it lets go of the ones that you've not made any use of. And that creates space. So that means that during adolescence, you've got space to build, a lot of space to build a lot more. So although we know that adolescence also comes with other factors about emotional maturing or immaturity, nonetheless, from the learning point of view, it's a prime time. And I think sometimes in schools, how people thought about this was, if you didn't do well in primary, basically, you're destined. We know what's going to happen. Really, I mean, we can try hard and we can maybe tweak at the edges here. But basically, if you didn't do well by the time you moved up from primary to secondary, it's unlikely that you're going to be a high flyer. And that is absolutely wrong. You could not have done well at all in primary and come out as one of the absolute top people in secondary. It's all to play for. So I think that kind of, I think what neuroplasticity does and why it's really, really helpful and it's really important in educational terms is it's hugely optimistic. It opens up this whole range of possibilities for individuals, so that and I think for I think that's such a great story, but for everybody really. I mean, it's obviously for the individual child, it's a great story because, if I've been doing so well, it's not the end of the world. It's just not yet. And And then for their parents, that's also a great story. Because, I remember when I was a parent and I kind of used to go to school and hear the teachers' feedback on my children, and I'd be sort of sitting there crossing my fingers thinking, well, I hope it turns out that my child is good. But, how do I know? Because I've only got them, I don't know what the benchmark is. So, so, so for parents, it's really reassuring. And even more for teachers, the kind of idea that you're in the driving seat there, building these brains and enabling people to do things that you never thought they could do, they never thought they could do. I mean, it's a fantastic time to be teaching. And I think the only thing that we have to do is let go of the past and embrace this new future. And I guess, one of the things that I kind of say about world-class schools, if you're not embracing this new future, you can't describe yourself as world-class. If you're still stuck in the past, where even if, you spend all your time trying to select the right students at the beginning to make sure you've got the best possible chance, I think, it's a bit of a waste of time, really. Just get your students in and do really great things with them, and then it will all come good. So I think, I wouldn't say that neuroscience has reinvented the world, because psychology had found lots of these things in different ways before. But what it does is it validates all of that work through psychology, and it explains why some of the features that psychology already knew about actually occur. So it's a kind of, as I say, it's a great time. But I'm just going to put one final rider on it and say that, as with anything that comes into the education space, you need to be careful. It's not a silver bullet. And it is the case that you will find certain things which are said about neuroscience, which may not be heavily research based or very accurate. So, you'll get these sort of tricks and techniques. If you do this, it'll all build brains better kind of thing. You should be skeptical about that. What you need to understand is the basics around it. And because the basics, it's all really optimistic, but just don't get misled by, kind of sort of, well, we all know, in the past with things like learning styles and brain gym and all of that kind of thing, these things come in and they sound really exciting and fancy and they're attractive. But they're not well validated, they're not well researched. So just watch out for them. Is kind of what I'm saying.
No, you've made some brilliant points, but I want to go back to something you started to talk about, and that is world-class schools. I want to know, what's your definition of a world-class school?
So we have 3 points that we make in terms of a world-class school, although we do have a kind of rubric for what a world-class school is. But the 3 points are, the first is that almost everyone achieves highly within the school, regardless of their background or their starting point. So that's the first point. If you're going to be world-class, and I don't think that's related to how much the fees are for your school, educational quality is not fee related. Basically, but if you're in a space where we know that probably everyone could achieve highly, then if you are not in the space where that is occurring, you're not world-class. So whatever the raw material, to be world-class, the vast majority of your students, whatever their starting point, have to be progressing in such a way that they're getting to these high levels of performance on academic tests and in other kinds of ways. So that's point number one. Point number two is that they develop the values, attitudes, and attributes that make them able to thrive in university, in the workplace, and in their future life. So for a world-class school, they're not just creating test passers who can be drilled to pass the relevant test, and then once they move on from school, have none of the tools in the toolkit to be able to do well.
What are some of those tools?
Well, things like, there are obvious things like kind of hard work, resilience, persistence, and the ability to sort of keep at it and practice when things go wrong. But there are also things like empathy and and, your ability to collaborate with a diverse range of people, some of whom may have opinions very different from your own. Your kind of open-mindedness in terms of, kind of listening and hearing and being prepared to alter your views and opinion. And being kind of curious and inquiring and wanting to go after something. And a bit enterprising because, in my life, I'm also an employer. And one of the things that I want as an employer is for my staff to be, to really both be curious and enjoy what they're doing, but also to be willing to solve problems themselves rather than just come and identify the problem and ask you what to do. You want the solution finders. So if you've been educated in such a way where you've been routinely kind of asked to solve problems and find solutions, and you've been rewarded for that, then that's what you expect to do in the workplace. But if you've been educated in such a way that you've just been fed a diet of this is what you need to do in order to pass the test, then when things appear in a way that's not expected, then you're really fazed by it. So I think we've seen that in during the COVID pandemic, that students who've been educated in a way where they're routinely required to kind of think for themselves and be a bit enterprising. I wouldn't say that the pandemic was easy for them, but it was easier than it was for people who were reliant. So, for students who are kind of reliant on the teacher telling them what to do next all the time, the unfamiliar is not great for them. And it's interesting in kind of the work that I do in terms of how people get to be successful. Because when you sit an exam, one of the things that's really happens is that when you're sitting an exam, some of the questions will be very straightforward, and some of them, they will be recognizable and you'll know what to do. But the way that all tests are constructed is they are in these three bands, the kind of settling questions, those are the ones everybody should be able to do. They're the ones which, if you've done the work, you ought to be able to do. And then there's what's called the unfamiliar questions. So the question is deliberately phrased in such a way that it's not immediately obvious to you. And you have to get those ones right if you're going to do well in the exams. And people who have been drilled for the test cannot do those ones because it comes up in a form they didn't expect. And then they're kind of like at a fork in the road, and they're kind of like, well, I don't know what to do. And what you really want is for them to look at it and think, well, I don't know, that wasn't really what I was expecting. On the other hand, it's a bit like something we once did here or something we once did there, and the intellectual confidence to think, well, I'm just going to go with that. So that, that those attitudes, which I'm talking about in being very important later in life in terms of the workplace and university, for example, are actually also really important in standard school exams. And I guess the final thing I'd kind of say about that in that second range of being world class is that, you want people who are have a concern for society, who want to play a role in making things better in the world in which they live, whether that's at a local or a national or an international level. And it's kind of gratifying that some of the real movers and shakers in terms of changing opinions at the world level are very young. And I think what we need to do is help young people to develop a sense of self and have a voice of their own in such a way that they can use it for a societal good. So what we don't want to do is, kind of develop people who are just in it for themselves and greedy and etc. And so the second piece is about developing the kind of student who can kind of care about other people, be confident, be enterprising, be unfazed by the new, because new things are happening all the time and we're speeding all that up. Everything's, the rate of change is getting faster all the time. So we want people who are not fazed by that. In fact, they embrace it. They're kind of like, okay, so what am I going to do in that circumstance? So as you're world-class school, you have to be developing both of those things. And I guess, many schools are on that track. I just think to be world-class, you have to be amplifying that. So you're building in opportunities for example, for individual students to find their own voice. So that might be in a very, in a very practical way. You might actually have it built in that they have every child has a certain number of opportunities to speak in some sort of public arena during the time that they're at school. I mean, I'm just picking a very tangible example, but what I'm saying is, if you want that kind of outcome, you have to build it into what you deliver.
Yeah.
And then my third category. So you want everybody to do well on the academics. You want them all to get the values, attitudes, and attributes they're going to need. And the third thing that makes a world-class school is they deliver that consistently every year, regardless of circumstances. And the pandemic's been absolutely fascinating about that, because really top world-class schools have still delivered. They've had to flex, they've had to go online, everything else, but their students have still made remarkable progress, and they haven't seen this massive loss in learning that that is certainly the case that government are talking about in most parts of the world. And that is because the kind of if you're world class, you can flex to accommodate. And, so I've been talking there about something massive like a pandemic. But in a school, there's all kinds of things that happen. Like, you might have the maths teacher goes on long-term sick. So a world-class school can accommodate that. They can still deliver the same outcome year on year. I first started thinking about that, actually, Lisa, when somebody outside of education said to me, I don't really get schools in this sense, because they always give you a reason for why things didn't work out. And they're very good at giving you the reason for why it didn't work out. But what he said to me was, so let me put it to you this way. If I go to a top class Michelin starred restaurant for dinner, I expect to get a top class Michelin starred meal. And I don't really want to know about what's been happening in the kitchen, whether the suppliers didn't supply the right things or the sous chef didn't show up or any of those things. The job of a Michelin star restaurant is to get a Michelin star meal out every time. And actually, that's a really interesting analogy because basically, for a world-class school, that's what you can do. You can get your Michelin starred meal out every time. And it's a really interesting idea when you put that to schools who are really, really strong schools and say, how well prepared are you for, how much can you flex? How well prepared? How does that work? But that is what, so for me, those are the three things in broad terms that make a world-class school. And for other people, it's the journey you need to be on to how do I make progress towards getting there? Because I don't think it's the case that, just because you are one or you're not one, you've got to stay in the same place. That, once you've mapped out what the destination is and looked at the journey, you can make, pretty rapid progress towards it. And I think that's kind of, that's what senior leaders should be about. It should be about those bold and big ideas, those big visions for what we need to do. And then what are the individual steps that we need to take in order to make it occur?
Yeah. While you were talking, there was just so much richness in there. And that idea of schools not having that continuity plan is so true. It is so true. Schools are some schools, of course, are very good at telling you why certain things didn't work and why there is a drop in grades or a this or a that. And when you think of it, whether it's a Michelin starred restaurant or a flight, you don't want to know that, the pilot who should have been flying this 747 is actually ill. You just want to know there is another pilot fully capable, fully trained, who is able to sit in that seat and pilot that flight to whatever destination it is. And oh my gosh, I hope people are getting that kind of penny drop moment that I just got listening to this podcast, because that is exactly what just happened. I'm thinking, yes, that is something we don't often think about. Let's talk about the journey to being world class.
Yeah.
Schools want to get on that journey because it's not something that you can do overnight. right? And we can talk a lot about the things that schools can do to become world class. Let's talk about some of the things they need to stop doing immediately if they want to be world class. What are some of those things?
Well, some of them are about the language that they use with students. So when, we do know that what teachers say to students can have a very profound effect on them, positively or negatively. So sometimes just in a kind of an aside comment can be really damaging. And there are people, there are very famous people where you can record where they've kind of said, that a teacher made some kind of comment and then they felt they were incapable of doing something, which they've then gone on to make an entire career out of. So, so firstly, you have to stop. You have to stop the careless, backhanded comment. But the sort of comments that often get made, and they're not always intentionally detrimental, is that we sometimes talk about individual children as being good at one thing or not so good at something else. So we'll say, well, you're in my maths class and, frankly, you're just not a mathematician. You're great in the English department, but, your maths is just not your thing. And they have to stop doing that because it is the case that it will build that idea in the mind of the student that maths is not their thing and that they're not good at it. And you just get that in exactly the same way. If I take that example a step further to parents, if you didn't do very well at maths and your child comes home from school and says, I've got this maths homework to do. And if what you say to them is, well, I know you're finding it hard, but I wasn't very good at maths either. And it runs in the family. Well, then it jolly well will run in the family. So this kind of idea that you can't, it has to stop. So one of the things you have to do is you have to stop all of the language that relates to that. So we, in high performance learning, we have this sort of, this hashtag everyone can. But so part of what we work with schools on is what is the positive language that suggests it's just not yet. And that in order to get to where you want to go to, the mantra is, which is Anders Ericsson's work in Florida State, it's practice, practice, practice. So you have to practice the right, he calls it deliberate practice, which means doing the right practice. But the kind of, you have to stop saying, things are as they are and it would always be like that, which is what you're implying in many ways. And even if you're saying, you've made good progress from where you were last time, but you're still sort of saying it in such a way that you're still miles off where you need to be. That's just not helpful. You need to be, in terms of giving feedback, you need to be giving the feedback that says, this is what high performance would look like in this particular situation. This is where you are in relation to that. This is the progress you've made from where you were before, and that's great progress. There's still this gap that we're going to work together so that you can really close that gap and get to be a high performer. So you've got to move into that kind of space of building and out of the space of measuring. And I think particularly in the roughly last 10 years, we've become in school we went through a phase before that where we didn't have very much data. Then suddenly we've got shed loads of data and we've become data driven in a way that is unhelpful because we need to be data informed rather than data driven. So if I take an example of what I mean, and this is what you have to stop doing, in one of the things you have to stop doing. If you are in the business of your students doing any kind of predictive cognitive ability testing, which is not a bad thing, but what it does is it generates, you sit the test in when you're 11 and it predicts what you're likely to get in your IGCSEs at 16, right? So that in one sense, that's kind of helpful for the school in that it gives you a kind of sense of that. But what it tends to have done is to have tipped over into sort of any individual teacher feeling, well, if they got the predicted grade, I've done my job. Okay? So what I'm saying is the predicted grade it's a calculated algorithm from tens of thousands of people who sat that same test. And even at the most basic level, there are two variables which you should be looking at and talking about within your school. And one is that this is not the person that sat the test in your school. They are not just anybody. They are a particular kind of person. And so they themselves can bring more to the party if they so choose to do. So they can outperform their predictions if they choose to do so. And then secondly, they're coming to your school. Are you really prepared to just accept that if they just went to any old school, they get this predicted grade? Is there no added value from being in your school? What's your added value? So I think that those sort of cognitive ability type tests, they've got a place, provided that you use that data to inform what you're doing and sort of say, this is the absolute minimum that you would get as an outcome from us. But frankly, we're not going to be dictated by that because this is just how you had filled in that test when you were 11. You're a different person when you're 13. Whatever you did when you sat the test at 11 was a snapshot in time and no more. And so you've got to stop. One of the things schools have got to stop is this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy stuff, whereby, we think we've got the data, therefore we know the outcome. We'll just kind of, you stick around for the next 5 years and you'll get the outcome that we all knew you would get. That has got to stop. It's got to be a completely different way of thinking about that. And then I guess another thing that I think, schools need to at least look at carefully, even if they don't completely stop it, they need to move from setting to what we call intelligent student grouping. So it's not, so in terms of when you look at that whole problem of setting, firstly, we know that people who don't make the top set will be disadvantaged unless you do something particular. So why do we set? Well, the reason we set is nothing to do with the students. It's all to do with the fact that it's easier to teach a less wide range of performance. So, and I use the word performance deliberately because one of the things you need to drop is the word ability. That's 20th century thinking. Talk about performance. So when you talk to a student, you need to be saying you're performing at this level or you're not performing at the level I want, rather than that you're more able or less able or whatever. Mm-hmm. So drop ability as a concept. But when you're thinking, and that means don't have ability groups in your sets, you can if you must, you can have performance sets, because performance sets suggest that if your performance changes, you can move around. But just ask yourself, why are we doing this performance grouping? Or is it because it's more convenient from the teacher point of view? Or is it because we think it really does enhance the speed of progress for students? So don't do it unless you need to. And if you need to, so we don't say you shouldn't do it, but if you need to do it intelligently. So the second set should be going to the same destination as the first set. Mm. You might be using some different teaching techniques. You might be putting in some more support. You might be going more slowly. They need to go to the same destination, not an inferior destination. So, there's a kind of, and that's quite challenging, because normally schools have thought, so the top set are the ones who are going to get certain grades, and then the second set are going to get the next set of grades below that broadly, and the occasional one might outperform. So what you've got to start thinking is, no, we're not going for that. We're aiming for everyone to get to the same destination, but we're just going by different routes. And that is a big challenging thing. And when we're working with schools to adopt HPL in their schools, it's definitely one of the things that's most controversial when you discuss it as a whole school level. Because, sometimes the question of why people have worked in those sorts of ability groups, sometimes it's just historic. Sometimes it's just that, teachers like it better. Sometimes it's parents like it better. But what you have to say is that from what we now know about how people develop, is it the optimal way for us to work? Because it may actually be causing us to limit the performance for our school. So if you're going to judge your performance by how well your students do, it may be one of the things that is stopping you from doing well. So, I think that's another of these things that you need to, even if you don't completely stop, you need to reframe it and consider using it more judiciously. And I think that's when we work with schools, when schools work with us at high performance learning, one of the things that we're doing with them is taking them systematically through a stage of a set of hoops, really, in terms of thinking about looking at the things they have traditionally done through this different lens. So we call it the HPL lens. This kind of idea that everyone could achieve potentially could achieve highly, and also that we know the things that matter. And are we systematically developing the things that matter in the school, or are we doing some things that are actually stopping those things from occurring? Because, and as I say, the simplest one is definitely language, the language we use and the language we convey to our students, because that's what they pick up. The sense for them, their sense of self is, it's a really fascinating thing, this, about how any of us, how you, how I, developed a sense of what we are and what we're capable of. And it is influenced not just by school, it's influenced by parents, it's influenced by wider society. But you kind of, what you want to do is do that in the most constructive possible way. So it's not that you're kind of being utopian and saying, you will definitely be a rocket scientist no matter what. What you're kind of saying, though, is that you have it deep inside you there to do whatever it is you really want to do. And what we're doing is providing you with the opportunities, the support. We're encouraging you, motivating you to be able to make that happen. And even if you haven't gone the full distance by the time you leave us, we want you to go with that belief that it's still just not yet, that it's still possible. Because, the entire world is littered with people who didn't do well at school, but then went on to do amazing things. So there's just no reason to suppose that, if you didn't do well at school, then everything is lost. It certainly isn't. And with that, we want to instill that belief. I think we kind of, if I've summarized that to say, what do people need to do more than anything else? They need to stop creating winners and losers. They need to start creating all winners.
Yeah, there was so much in there. When you started talking about setting, my mind went back to my days in school and when I led schools and when I taught, and I thought, wow, we did a lot of stuff wrong. We did have set, I can remember we had meetings in which we were looking at which teachers we would put to teach the top set. And it was always a conversation with the SLT around, let's put our best teachers to teach the top set, or let's put that teacher who has really great subject knowledge and not very good behavior management skill to teach the top sets, because that teacher is going to push that academically, and those kids in the top set don't give as much trouble as the kids in the middle set or the bottom set. And then, of course, if you were the unlucky teacher who got the dreaded bottom set, then you were obviously out of grace and favor, and you were miserable for a year until you could work your way out of purgatory, so to speak. Oh my gosh. It was just, there's so much in there that schools really ought to stop doing, whether they are on their road to becoming world class, just for the mere fact that they want to do better by a student. They ought to stop doing some of those things.
Yeah, because, on the road to world class, really, for most schools, it really means that you're just ambitious and you want to do better than you're doing now. And some of those things that just really will make a massive difference to you in terms of, how your school performs. Because, like you as a teacher thinking, I've been dumped with the bottom set, I've got to work hard to get out of this and not have the bottom set next year. What students say is, if they're in the bottom set, when you interview them, what they say is, it's just awful. We know we're going to be in the bottom set forever. And actually that's what the research shows. If you're in the bottom set when you're 7, you're likely to be in it when you're 17. And it's like, imagine going to school every day knowing that there's kind of no way out. Sometimes I think we just need to stand in the shoes of the student and see it through their eyes. But I mean, in the end, what I kind of think, because in my teaching, when I was in my teaching career, I've done things which, now I wouldn't do. But that's the thing, is learning is a science, and we know a lot more now than we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And there's no shame in abandoning something you've been doing for ages just because we've learned to do it differently. Because just in the same as in the medical profession, we wouldn't expect to get the same treatment at the hospital that we might have got, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ago. Things move on. And that's how we should see it in teaching. And I think sometimes we're reluctant to do that. It's like, well, this is how I learned to do it, and it's worked well enough for me. And, why would I move on? And the short answer is because the state of the art is somewhere different now. So if you want to be a contemporary, up-to-date teacher, you need to evolve. And there's some fairly simple things that you can do in order to evolve. You don't have to sort of stop doing everything you used to do and start doing this magical new thing. You just have to be alert to and aware of some of the principles that underpin what we now know, and just tweak your practice. You don't need to sort of, because sometimes I think in education it's all out with the old and in with the new. And I just, it's not really about that. It's just about saying, do what you've always done, but do it better. Just tweak it a bit and do it better. And I think in the Middle East, again, you've got really interesting kind of cultural issues within the Middle East, which play both to have advantages and disadvantages. So you don't get as much problem around behavior as you get in some other countries. You do get it, and it's interesting that Emirati boys are very much like the UK working class boys in the sense of engagement with school. They have many of the same kinds of issues, but in terms of well, how do you approach that? It's definitely not, in my view, what the learning science tells us. It's not about excessive sanctions. It's about presenting more possibility for them and building forward with them. And it's not that once you've said that you've got it within you to be a high performer, it doesn't mean everybody suddenly starts to behave like an angel. But it does mean that they've got more skin in the game. They're more invested in doing well rather than just feeling I'm just kind of going along because I have to. And I think there are a lot of I've worked quite extensively across the GCC countries, and I think the kind of for the most part, people's willingness to work hard at school is a really strong asset in the Emirates and beyond. And I think we kind of need to play to that. But sometimes it's quite a narrow view of what doing well is. And I think what I'm kind of saying is that it is both academically and these broader pieces that equip you for future life, because the life you're going to lead is different from the one your parents led. And so you need different and complementary skills to that. But, I think part of the takeaway from it is that you don't need to make massive changes to what you do in order to get a really big dividend. And why we work at HPL, we work with entire schools, is because if you want to change things like the kind of the culture and language of a school, you need everybody bought in. So it's no good going to history and somebody saying, I believe that everyone can and every single one of you can do well. And then you suddenly move along to some other subject where they don't believe that, because you've just got conflicted students. So basically, if you want to kind of move into this space, it's really a whole school initiative. individual teachers, I'm not saying individuals can't do anything and they can't improve their own practice, they can. But if you want to get a really transformational change, and that's kind of, it's an overused word, but that's what we see schools getting, is they bring these ideas into the school, they flex them to make it fit their context. So it's the framework that we work with rather than a very prescriptive program. They flex them to make it work in their context. And then, they suddenly start to see all sorts of, they see outcomes that are beyond what they expected, and then they just get better and better at it. So I think, the key for me is make small changes, but make the ones that really make the difference, and then build on that. Don't try and, kind of suddenly change everything. The sort of the record of these big initiatives to change things at the school level is that by and large, they don't sustain over time, and they don't really work. It's a kind of bottom up thing, which makes a difference. But when you have that kind of bottom up change going on in every single classroom in your school, you've suddenly got one big change occurring, and it's almost like it happens almost without you noticing. It's just that your students become more confident, they're more engaged in lessons because you're demonstrating belief in them. Your teaching is just adjusted to accommodate that, and then everybody gets a bit braver. And the result is that the students do that bit better. And when you aggregate that for the entire school, it means your results go through the roof. And when I set up high performance learning, which is now I set it up in 2016, and when we survey, we enable schools to survey to see what they're doing. And the most reliable kind of survey results are just before the pandemic, because the pandemic results are all influenced by the pandemic. But just before the pandemic, when we did our annual results, about that 67% of our schools had the best results in the history of the school. Now, I don't think that's because HPL is magic. I think it's because schools know what matters, and when they do those things, it really makes a big difference. And I think they've barely started. So, my kind of challenge to schools, which is in a positive kind of way, is to say that, the theory is, this is just the theory. The theory is that we all of us have it within us to become high performers. So how close can you get to that in your school? And, sometimes people say to me, well, surely you don't mean everybody can be a high performer. You've never taught student X in my class. And I'm like, I don't know how many people can ultimately become a high performer. I know what the theory says, but until we really try to do it in the education system, we will not know what's possible. But what I do know is that amongst the very best schools now, they are really pushing the boundaries in a way that we've never done before. And so I think I'd say, my kind of safe space would be to say that far more students could be high performers than we ever dreamed was possible. What percentage that is, we're in the discovery mode. Who knows? But I don't think that matters. I don't think it's even the discussion to be had. The discussion is, it's far more, so let's get on with it. It's kind of, here's the possibility. Let's grab it and see what happens. That's where I am.
Something you said there in terms of, when you say teacher X might say, you don't know student Y in my class. And I'm thinking, but that means if you're pointing that student out, you've already decided what that student can be, which is the complete opposite of what a high performance learning school would do, or world-class would do. You would leave that child to grow and excel and become the best that he or she can be. How many kids can become high performance? Irrelevant. The fact that you create that environment to foster high performance is what's relevant. I think that is what people need to pay more attention to. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, because exactly the example that you're picking on is when you were asking me what should schools stop doing. But if that belief is in the mind of that teacher, that, student Y, you've never met student Y, they're not going to be a high performer. I mean, it's absolutely the case that they're not meant to be, because that's what you believe. So if, in terms of having that negative belief about a proportion of your students, is really, really damaging. And when we do this, when we do surveying, we create baseline surveys with schools, and we ask all their staff to say how many people think that this idea that everyone could be a high performer is realistic. Do they believe that everybody that they teach could become a high performer? And normally at the start point, and remember that we work with a range of different types of schools, but some of which are some of the best schools in the world. About 36% of teachers in your average school think that it's possible. So you've got a big job to do to change that set of beliefs to get everybody. So when we're working with schools, after about 2 years, it's somewhere in the 80% or so. And by the time they've been sort of working with us for 4 or 5 years, it's close to 100%. But that's partly because the vast majority of people really do genuinely believe it and seen its benefit. And the occasional one that doesn't just moved on to somewhere else. Because if we're in a school where we believe this, we want everyone to be singing from the same song sheet about it, and enabling our students to really do that. And I guess, what I kind of feel with high performance learning is that as a sort of an approach and methodology, why I set up our organization to work on it was partly to get the message out there, but I could have done that by just standing on conference stages. It's really that you need help with how to adopt if you're going to do this well. And so that's why we exist, is to help schools to do it well. And then we accredit them. And the ones who are, kind of getting close to being world class in the way that we were talking about, we accredit them as world class schools. But we also accredit other schools as high performing schools who are on the journey and ambitious and reaching the standards which suggests that they're making really good progress. Because then, I think that's what we're saying about schools, in the same way as you say about students, is that we think everybody could get there. We just think people are on a journey, and we want to celebrate the point on the journey and encourage them to go further. Because, and as I said earlier in our kind of discussion, that sometimes, kind of when you have a discussion in your part of the world, sometimes, price point comes in as a sort of, as a shorthand proxy for, kind of, this is a great school because it's a premium school and charges a lot. And this is a mid-market school, and the sort of inferences, and therefore the standards will be somewhat inferior to the premium schools. And I guess I think it is a bit more like airlines. You can all go to the same destination. Some of it, you may travel first class, or you may go to more less. Like most of us travel in economy most of the time, but that doesn't really matter. The fact is that educational quality is not dictated by the price you pay. And so we should be really encouraging schools that are lower cost schools to be aiming for the top as well as the premium schools. I mean, obviously for premium schools, it's tremendously important because, you need to deserve the fee that you're charging. And we think that, you could go further than you have traditionally gone. And so the schools that we work with in that space, they are setting the new standard. And it is the standard that parents are coming to expect. So if I'm playing a premium price tag, this is the standard I am expecting now.
Yeah.
But I'm also saying that doesn't mean that this is just something for the very top schools. This is also for ambitious mid-market schools who want to get to high levels of quality, and it doesn't cost money. It's it's attitudinal.
Yeah.
So
I like that.
And I think that is it's a good thing. It's a good thing about learning science. It's about, we know when we discover new things that could make a difference, it doesn't actually cost any money to put them into place. It's just the commitment and the organization and the kind of going through the process of adopting properly as a school.
It's amazing because sometimes, as you rightly mentioned, in this part of the world, the premium schools are always calling themselves world-class schools. They actually put that in their marketing. And a lot of times it's attached not to the mindset, not to the practices, but to the facilities and to the breadth of the curriculum on offer. And I love the fact that being a high performance school is not tied to your fee band. You can be in the lower or mid market band and you can still be a high performance school. I just glanced at my watch and realized we've been talking for over an hour. There's so much to unpack. It's been an absolute pleasure just learning and just listening. Where do schools begin? Let's say they want to start on this high performance journey and they want to learn more about high performance learning. Where do they start?
Well, I think there's two ways really. I mean, firstly, we're always really interested to talk to them, and especially to senior leaders who are serious about thinking about this for their school. And that's so you just need to. We've got a website, highperformancelearning.co.uk, or you can just contact us direct at office at highperformancelearning.co.uk. And there's no obligation to work with us as a result of that. It's just an exploratory conversation. So I'm just saying, if you're interested, reach out. Don't think, they're going to try and sell me something. Just think, I want to talk about it. And then if you're not really at that kind of stage, and particularly if you might be a teacher rather than a senior leader, and we have two books which are we call them the Red Book and the Black Book. So the Red Book is called High Performance Learning: How to Become a World-Class School, and you can get it on Amazon. It's under I'm the author, so it's under my name. And then we also have another one called Great Minds and How to Grow Them, and that's really I wrote it with a journalist, Wendy Berliner, and it's particularly aimed at parents, but if you want an introduction to this whole kind of area, it's a very easy read. Probably it's quite a slight book and doesn't take you more than a couple of hours max. So those are sort of ways to kind of acclimatize yourself. But I really, we already have some schools in the Middle East doing really good work with us, and I know that that word is getting out to other schools that this is something which genuinely makes a difference, really genuinely makes a difference. So, I'm reaching out to say, we want to talk to a whole lot more of you and to work with a lot more of you. And I'm not sure when this podcast will go out, but we come over to Dubai, particularly from time to time. And we'll be over again in May. So that's another thing that we could talk about, potentially ways to get closer to people. But just get in touch. I mean, I think if you're excited by these kinds of ideas, you're our people.
Okay, amazing. That's the part. Professor Deborah Eyre, thank you so much for
Thank you. No,
sharing. And we're going to link some of those things that you said, the books, etc., your contact info in the show notes so that people who've listened to this podcast and want to learn more, want to explore making their school a high performance school or just learning more about high performance learning, they can get in touch. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure. It's just a delight to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.